Okay, everybody, welcome to Exodus. We are halfway through. Any questions or comments or anything before we dive in? Bernie, we're going to get to your questions.
No,
Bernie has two really good questions that we're actually going to start the class with. I have them on slides, Bernie. What do you have, Tony?
Is this another one of the sections that is written by two people?
Three.
All of Exodus is written by three people.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Is there a reason why they keep repeating the same thing over and over again?
Because it's three different people telling their side of the story.
What I thought. Okay.
Yes. Every time you run into that repetition, it's three authors.
All right.
So the editor of Exodus kept all three voices and did not attempt to merge them or make sense of them. They let and the three different voices have three different theologies and beliefs and practices.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So anytime it gets weird and confusing, not anytime it gets weird, but anytime it gets confusing in Exodus, you can be pretty sure it's your multitude of authors coming into play. Okay. Okay. This week, we are diving into Passover, leaving, and struggling. We're doing 12 through 17. And I just want to remind you again, the arc of this story is the foundational relationship between Israel and God. I will take you to be my people. I will be your God. Exodus 6. Okay, so we've been through the prelude. We've been through the plagues. Now we're going to finish up with Passover and the departure and then the journey to Sinai. So they're heading back to Sinai. What's happened so far? Plagues, plagues, and more plagues. Lots of plagues. We saw lots of back and forth with Pharaoh. And we saw the two different authors in this section with different viewpoints on God and Moses in the plagues. One author believed that the plagues were intended to force Pharaoh's hand, and they involved back and forth with Pharaoh, giving him chances, taking it back, giving him another plague, back and forth. And then another author believed the plagues were to punish Israel for all that Egypt had done to Israel. So, and that all happens in one day. When you combine those two stories, you end up with 10 plagues. That's how we end up with it. Okay. We ended last week with the big warning about the final plague. About midnight, I will go through Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the female slave who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the livestock. So that was the final plague. What's about to happen? Passover is going to happen. It's going to be time to leave Egypt. There's going to be the crossing of the Red Sea. We're going to talk about what actually was bread from heaven, and then we're going to talk about water from rocks, those times in the wilderness. Okay, before we begin, Bernie had two great questions I wanted everyone to hear. First of all, did the Egyptians have gods? And I think the real critical word here is gods, plural. So Egyptian religion was polytheistic. Almost all of the ancient communities and cultures surrounding Israel are polytheistic. So meaning there's a multitude of gods who were believed to reside in and control the forces of nature. So the gods had amazing variability in both their nature, their characteristics, and their capacity. In Egypt, the formal religious practices centered on the pharaoh, who was believed to be divine. And the pharaoh acted as the intermediary between the people and the gods. His role was to sustain the gods so that the gods could maintain order in the universe. So a divine role. Most gods are generally benevolent, but their favor could not be counted on. They had to be worshipped to embody their image. So that's why in the ancient world you had all of the temples. They were the manner in which gods were sustained, where their physical images were housed and cared for. They were not a place for the average person to go and worship. It was a different type of worship than I think we think of. And then gods had regional associations, so they corresponded to very specific locations. So in Egypt, you could pull up a map and you could see gods centered in different locations. And some gods were linked to particular animals. And again, when you talk about the Egyptian historical arc, you're talking about thousands of years of gods. And again, this polytheistic approach to worship and the supreme ruler being divine is not unique to Egypt. That is what is surrounding Israel, and not unique to Israel. While it is monotheistic, Israel is going to struggle with polytheism for centuries. So that's why in the Hebrew scriptures, you see this emphasis over and over and over. My God, the one God, you should worship this God, no other gods. We're going to see this when we come to the 10 Commandments. It's going to be the first commandment. It's because Israel, within this context of polytheism, is struggling with polytheism. And archaeologists have found in ancient Israelite settings polytheistic cult images buried in homes. This was something that continued on throughout the arc of Israel's time. They struggled with this, and they were surrounded by it, so it made sense they struggled with it. Okay, some of ancient Egypt's gods. So then the other question Bernie had, which is in the Egyptian historical record, what does it say about the plagues? And there's an interesting body of work right now based on what's in the Egyptian record about a volcanic eruption. And the volcanic eruption happened on a Greek isle about 1600 BCE. And some of what they're doing is tracking back what might have happened from this eruption, which exists in the Egyptian historical record, that the winds would have carried the volcanic ash to Egypt, and the ash and the acids from the ash could have turned the rivers red. The acidity in the water would have caused frogs to leap out. Insects would have burrowed eggs in generating lava. The ash in the atmosphere would have caused acid rain, which could have caused boils. The grass would have been contaminated, poisoning the animals that ate it. The humidity would have caused locusts. There could have been several days of darkness. And there is in the Egyptian historical record accounts of children dying. So Bernie, that was your question. What exists in the historical record about the plagues? What mainly exists is this giant volcanic eruption that happened in 1600s.
Thank you.
Okay, let me just stop there and just check in. So that's the context that they're leaving from. Any questions on any of that?
I've seen Santorini in that big area where they had it. It's like, I encourage everybody to look that up online.
It's a big call, isn't it? Yeah.
It's huge. And you would never dream when you're sitting there looking out at the beautiful water, you wouldn't get that that's what happened. And then when you hear what happened and look again, it's like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So go ahead, Paul.
So we hear a lot about Moses, but who's Aaron? He always mentions Moses and Aaron. Who's Aaron?
Aaron is his brother.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we met Aaron very briefly when Moses came back, and Aaron's going to come into play more now that they're going to be leaving Egypt.
Right.
It's
But
kind of
Moses was raised by the Egyptian monarchy.
Yes,
How was Aaron raised? Was he just by his?
as a slave, as a slave.
Okay, thank you.
The story goes. Okay, let's start with Exodus 12. Anybody want to read this one? Go ahead, Tony.
Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go, select lambs for your family and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood in the basin. None of you shall go outside the door of your house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike down the Egyptians. When he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over that door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your house to strike you down. You shall observe this rite as a perpetuity ordinance for you and your children. When you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this observance. Oh God, am I good today?
Observance.
Observance. And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this observance? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord. For he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed down and worshiped. The Israelites went and did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron.
Thanks, Tony. So two things are happening in this. Let me switch. One of which is happening is we're hearing the story of what the Israelites are to do, but we're also hearing the commandment to ritualize this. So both things are happening in this passage. So this is the plague climax, the death of the Egyptian firstborn, but not just the Egyptian firstborn, the firstborn of the slaves, the firstborn of all of the livestock, and then the subsequent departure. There are multiple accounts of these final moments. So this is the point, Tony, where it was probably very confusing because there are multiple accounts here and it sounds repetitive, but each one is a little bit different. The term Passover is a translation of the word Pesach, which is the name of the festival and the term for what God does with regards to the Israelites. They mark the doors and God will pass over. It doesn't mean pass over. Actually, it means protect. That God will protect those. No plague will strike them. Okay, and then here's what happened with the actual leaving. Who would like to read that one?
I will.
Thanks, Chris.
At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all of his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Rise up, go away from my people, both you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you said. Take your flocks and your herds as you said, and be gone, and bring a blessing on me too." The Egyptians urged the people to hasten their departure from the land, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The Israelites had done as Moses told them. They had asked the Egyptians for jewelry of silver and gold and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. And so they plundered the Egyptians.
So much to struggle with in this passage. There's a lot in this one. So after the plague, Moses tells Pharaoh, we need to go. And And Pharaoh says, okay, I've had enough. And Pharaoh's child is one of the ones that dies. So Pharaoh's heir, firstborn son, dies. So this is the opportunity that they've all been waiting for since the plague narratives began. They gather up all their possessions, including the dough which has not risen. There's no time to let the dough rise. They have to take it unleavened. And they're basically going to go under the cover of night because there's a pretty high likelihood Pharaoh's going to change his mind, as he has done so many times more. This plundering of the gold and silver from the Egyptians is going to be a pretty important plot element for our story later on, because it is going to be these metals that the Israelites are going to melt down to create the golden calf. So that is still to come. When you get to that point, you're going to wonder, where did they get all that stuff? This is what they took from the Egyptians. So now we're told that when it's time for them to leave, the Israelites number around 600,000 men. That's how come it gets extrapolated to about 2 million, that when you take it up to women and children. There's also language in there that calls it a mixed multitude went with him. So this is not really clear what this means, though it appears that there were non-Israelite slaves who were under Egyptian bondage who also did go with them. So the death of the firstborn and the departure from Egypt are really the high point of this story. The enslavement has ended. The Israelites are on their way to the promised land. God's going to leave them, but there's still a lot more to come. We still have the journey through the wilderness. We have the journey to Sinai. We have the giving of the covenant, which is really a critical part. So the Passover is a pretty central moment in this story, but it's not the end of the story. Okay, so let's talk about what happens next, which is the Passover ritual. Will someone read this one?
I can.
Thank you, Shirley.
Moses said to the people, remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by strength of hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Aviv, you're going out. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance in this month. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen in your possession, and no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. You shall tell your child on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. It shall serve for you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the teaching of the Lord may be on your lips. For with a strong hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. You shall keep this ordinance at its proper time from year to year.
So what's happening here is we're extending this beyond from event, a Passover event, and it's becoming a Passover ritual. So this is going to become and be memorialized in the Israelite festival calendar. Within Judaism, this is the big one. This is really a critical festival, right? And part of this is that, you know, you're going to remember that unleavened bread, that leaving quickly in the night. So even though, right, the story probably is not true, these scriptures, these texts are forming the basis of a ritual that is going to continue on through centuries. So it is going to be what those rituals and those holidays are going to be what sustains the Jewish people. And when I send out the link to this week's recordings, in there I've got a article. If you're not familiar what happens on Passover, or if you've never experienced a Seder or been a part of that, it's a good article that provides an overview of what a contemporary Passover is like for folks. Okay, let's get
Marci,
to the.
Marci,
Yeah.
what's the significance of the leavened or unleavened bread? I don't get it.
They didn't have time for the bread to rise.
Oh,
So usually when you bake bread, you have to proof it, and it's got to sit for hours to let it rise. They didn't have time. They just had to take the bread and go. And so they basically cooked it fast so it was flat, and that's why, and then they ran. That's the story. And then so how that's carried out in modern tradition is this remembrance using the unleavened bread or your matzah, those types of unleavened wheat products.
thanks.
Okay, let's do the Red Sea, another great story. Who wants to read this one?
I
I
will.
will.
Oh, Marie, why don't you go ahead? I saw your hand.
Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn, the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left.
I guess I'm assuming most people saw the movie The Ten Commandments. I have to tell you, when I was a kid, we went to, I'll just stop sharing for a second. We went to Universal Studios back before it was a theme park, and it was a studio, and you do the studio tour. And one of the things you got to see was the Red Sea, and the tram goes through the Red Sea. I don't know if anybody else did this tour back in the 70s, but I will tell you it was very anticlimactic because the Red Sea was only about that deep. So it did not live up to my expectations. I was expecting something way more exciting when my experience of the Red Sea. So. Okay, so let's talk about the Red Sea. So, when Pharaoh lets the people go, God does not take them the short route. Instead, God leads them towards a body of water that's known as the Red Sea. This is the water between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. So it's about, in width, it's about 100 to 175 miles. So it's not insignificant to pass through it, right? But again, what happens is they come to it. Moses stretches out his hands, the water recedes. But the Egyptians are pursuing them. So again, this is not a historical memory, and we're going to talk about where this actually may come from. But this is, think of it as kind of a creative, imaginative attempt to give expression to this belief that Yahweh, God rescued God's people, God and has overthrown the Egyptians. Some really beautiful imagery.
Wow. Yeah.
And then this one, if anybody's seen it. Okay, so this is from the movie. This
Yeah.
is what I was imagining, the tram ride. I was gonna be down there in the tram. No, it barely came up to my knee as a child. Very disappointing.
Definitely more than 2 or 3 feet.
Okay, here's probably where this story came from. Will somebody read Exodus 15 for us? And Paul, did you have your hand up to read?
Well,
Oh, do you have a
yes, I
question?
did. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. His picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone.
So it's what that is, what Paul just read is a very, very ancient hymn. And it is some of the oldest poetry that exists in the Bible. So it's a very, very old hymn. It actually doesn't say anything about the Israelites coming to the Red Sea. It talks more, if you look, about Pharaoh and his army being thrown into the sea, right? So this is a hymn that's often attributed to Moses' sister Miriam. Apparently it was pretty common. It was known in more than one form. And like I said, it's not really about the Red Sea. There's no mention of the sea or dry land. It's really about this conflict between Yahweh and Pharaoh and casting Pharaoh and his army into the sea. So, so it's not a complete kind of ballad that tells the story. It's not describing a historical event. But some biblical scholars think that this little piece here, this very ancient hymn, preceded this piece about the Red Sea. So that the Red Sea was actually a story that was derived from this little hymn here. That's where they think it comes from. So again, but we're not talking about historical events. We're talking about a creative way to tell this story of God and God's people, right? So go ahead, Paul.
So I've had a question that's been kind of in the back of my mind since we started this. So at first, God says, I'm here to save the people, the Jewish people in Egypt. Moses, you go do it. And then you get to, and he keeps on telling Moses to do all these things. He gets to the Red Sea and he says, Moses, you go raise your rod. And then supposedly he, God, parts the water with the east wind or some such. Why? So why doesn't he do it directly? I mean, he gets credit for hardening Pharaoh's heart. He doesn't have anybody else do that.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused.
So confusion is a very appropriate reaction to Exodus, because when you say Moses is doing this or God's doing this, when you read it, you're reading 3 different authors telling the story. So in some of those authors, God is doing everything. God's pulling the strings on everything. In some of them, Moses is acting through God. And in the other one is like a combination of them. So confusion should be a normal reaction to reading Exodus, because you're seeing those 3 different theologies or beliefs or understandings about God. So why doesn't God just take care of it? In some of the writings, particularly in the plagues, that one of the authors is writing it as God took care of it. God's doing all of this stuff. And another one, it's happening through Moses. So it is a confusing thing. Go ahead, Tony.
I just have a question for contemporary. What is the religion in Egypt? Are they Muslims? Are they?
It's actually one of the Egypt is primarily Muslim. I couldn't tell you. There's two primary sects in Islam: Sunni and oh my
Shia.
gosh,
Shia.
Shiite. And I couldn't tell you in Egypt which one it was. There's a very small community of Coptic, which is Christian. The article I'm going to send you today is actually about the Jewish community in Egypt that has left, that is doing an exodus out of a lot of the Middle East countries. So there used to be very big, thriving Jewish communities in a lot of the Arab countries, and those are diminishing rapidly.
But you're talking about modern day Egypt, not when we are talking of
Yep.
Exodus.
Yep. Tony asked just about today. What's the makeup of Egypt today?
Okay.
It is a Muslim country. Yeah. My dog is snoring up a storm today. Okay. So about back to that hymn, we don't really know what it is or what it does, but it probably is likely the hymn came first and then the story of the Red Sea came after that. Okay. Did they really cross the Red Sea, and why it may not matter? Okay, so again, there's very little in the historical record that shows 2 million people leaving Egypt in any mass exodus. There's no historical record of 2 million people moving through that area for any length of time. There is in the historical record enslaved Israelites, and there is in the historical record small pockets of escaped slaves that happen. So that's what exists in the historical memory. So, but there is probably something in that historical memory of some enslavement that fed the story and the creation of this kind of giant narrative. And again, the crossing of the Red Sea piece probably comes from that very ancient hymn, which probably has a little bit of connection somewhere back to history, but we're never going to know. Okay, regardless of the historical nature of the story, this story becomes the foundational myth of Israel. It is more important than any other biblical story for establishing Israelite and Jewish identity, right? It is also repeatedly invoked as a point of reference in the prophets, which are to come in Isaiah and Jeremiah. They're going to reference the Exodus story at that point in time. So these other Hebrew scripture authors they know this story. They're going to reference this foundational story. And we're also going to hear it in the New Testament. And that story is going to become kind of an archetype that is going to be used throughout history whenever there is a enslaved people seeking freedom. So another one of the articles I'm going to send you today, I don't usually send you so much reading, and you're welcome to ignore it. But one of the ones I found for you, which I found really fascinating, is how this Exodus language and myth has been used throughout American history, which I thought was very interesting, all the way up to Obama using it most recently. So it is one of the most influential and greatest stories in world literature. Okay, Exodus 16. They're across the ocean. They are headed to Mount Sinai. They have nothing to eat or drink. Would someone read this one?
I can do it.
Go ahead,
The
Carol.
house of Israel called it manna. It was a coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made from honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept through the generations in order that they may see the food with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the covenant for safekeeping. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to a habitable land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. And omer is a tenth of an ephah, which I have no, okay.
Well done, Carol. You got the short end of the stick this week. Okay, so they've left Mount Sinai. They're on their way to Mount Sinai. And again, you know, the story's coming full circle. They're going back to the mountain. That Mount Sinai is that where they saw that burning bush, right? So best guess is these are two different stories. So there's the Exodus story in Passover, and then there's this story of giving of the law that we're about to encounter. And so that's where we're headed right now. As it currently stands, though, those two have been connected and they end up in the culmination of the giving of the law. The giving of the law, when you hear that term, what that means is the 10 Commandments. So that's what we're about to get. Okay. So what did they eat and drink? Go ahead, Paul.
So is there something that they think, the Jewish people think, is manna in a jar that's survived the centuries?
No.
Okay.
Mm-mm. No. And we're going to talk a little bit about what it was. There's a lot of good theories on it. So they left with unleavened bread, silver and gold, very little food, and reality comes quickly. They've got to cross a desert, right? And the next section, there is just a ton of complaining. And a lot of finger pointing at Moses, right? Nothing to eat, nothing to drink, wishing they had died back in Egypt rather than starving in the desert. So they complain so much about Moses, God finally has enough and promises to rain down bread and provide them with quail meat and water. So what was manna? Best guess, it was the sap that came out of a desert plant caused by insects. So it's almost like the insects create a little wound and the sap flows up. And it was either that or it was a desert lichen, like a little moss, which is what I'm not going to preach on that on Sunday, but I am preaching on moss on Sunday. So that's what they eat. Okay. And then we're going to end this chapter with a very weird one, but it goes back to kind of Paul's question about who's Aaron. So will someone read Exodus 17 for us?
I will.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some men for us and go out. Fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. And whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary. So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the sun set. And Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the sword.
Such a weird story. I think everybody can agree. What was that? And where did they get the weapons? And why is this here? Okay. So this is a great example of just weirdness in the Bible that has nothing to do with the story at Tom. So centuries after the Exodus, the Amalekites will be the prominent enemies of Saul and David. So this is a little bit of authorial prejudice slipping in here. This has nothing to do with the story of Exodus. It really has to do with dissing these Amalekites centuries after the supposed event. So this is just one of those three Exodus authors slipping in a little diss. So I guess I put this story in the category of things that you find in the Bible that if you take them literally will do harm. But if you look at them within context of who it was written for and why it was written, they give you a completely different sense to the story. Okay. This is important though, because this is the first time we're going to meet Joshua. So in this story, we've got Aaron, Joshua's or Moses's brother. They're leading them out, right? And then this is the first time that Joshua comes in. Joshua is going to be the one who's going to lead the Israelites across the promised land. So we're not going to get to this in our study of Exodus because the book will end before then. But Moses doesn't make it to the promised land. He'll get to the River Jordan eventually, and he will die on this side of the River Jordan. And then Joshua will lead the Israelites across and into the promised land. And this is the first time. Okay. So in this, and this goes back to that question that you asked earlier, Paul, that the story depicts God as a warrior. So God's fighting for the Israelites in this story, right? So the question I'm going to send you out into groups is, how does this characterization of God fit with or contradict our modern images of God? So the warrior God. And this also is the God who is willing to sacrifice the firstborn of everybody but God's people, God's chosen people, to save them. So this kind of warrior salvation forming God, I want you to kind of wrestle with and think about. I'm going to actually...
Marci,
Go ahead, Bernie.
before we break up into groups, I'm not familiar enough with the Jewish Bible, but does God get so personified and among the people in anything other than Genesis and Exodus? In the other books of the Jewish Bible?
Yeah. It's pretty common throughout the Torah, this intense personification of God. So God's going to, again, when they come to the River Jordan, God's going to part the water so that the Israelites can cross into Jordan. It's kind of like this fantastical scene out of a Steven Spielberg movie. And you're going to see that in the prophets as well. You see it in the Psalms and in the wisdom literature. So it's definitely common.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
And so Aaron was a brother of Moses. Is Joshua a brother of Moses? Or is he just a guy?
I think he's just a guy. I don't think he has any relationship.
And who is her?
Well, I don't know who her is. I'll find that one out for you in breakout rooms. What about you, Marley?
If that's a movie, Ben-Hur.
I know, maybe.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking of as we read this is the current situation in Israel and Palestine and the attitude that the Israelis have that it's their country, they dominate the Palestinians. And kind of that justification for what they're doing, which bothers me a lot.
That's another one of the articles I'm going to send you.
Good.
I want to talk about that when you all come back. So I'm going to send you maybe for like 7 or 8 minutes. And what I want you to talk about is what benefit does the warrior God give? And does it have any usage in our contemporary times? Okay, I'll see you back here in a few minutes. Here comes the rest. Welcome back. Welcome back. It looks like we have another room missing.
The big talkers, huh?
Ernie, Paul, and who? I can't. Oh, and Chris.
Chris.
Yeah.
Big talkers.
There's one.
There they are. Okay, what'd you come up with? What great insights did you come up with?
We have a question from Marci. One of the things that we see here is all this domination and subjection of the other peoples, and how that relates to where Israel finds itself now. And if all we read were these books of the Bible, I mean of the Old Testament, what books in the Old Testament share a different view of the world other than a warrior God? We know the New Testament, Jesus's story. Doesn't talk about that. What was the line you wanted, Marie? Lay down with the lions.
In the peaceable
Peaceable
kingdom, the
kingdom.
lion lies down with the lamb, and the child plays on the snake's den. He's safe. He's not. God doesn't run things like a warrior in the peaceable kingdom.
Where is that in the Bible?
Okay, so what you're experiencing is you saw in Genesis the God of creation, right? But you also saw the warrior God pop up in Genesis. In Exodus, you're seeing the God who's going to do anything to deliver God's people, right? So you're seeing the warrior God. So as opposed to thinking about it as New Testament, Old Testament, I would say think about it as the audience for which that text is written. So what type of situations where you would really want a warrior God? You would want, if you were in it's kind of like the book of Revelations, or any type of, there's parts in Mark where you get that apocalyptic literature, where I had this great professor once who said nobody who isn't living enslaved should read apocalyptic literature, because it's only intended to be written for people who have nothing to lose, that they are completely occupied in their lifestyle, in their livelihood, in everything about them. That's who this literature is written for. And so when you see that warrior God show up, as opposed to thinking about it as Old Testament, New Testament, think about what was the community that literature was written for needing at that point in time, and imagining an occupied people, what would offer salvation? A God that's going to come in and kick some butt, a God that is going to do anything possible to save, right? And so there are parts in the Hebrew scripture that in the Psalms that are deeply comforting. Like, what's the Psalm we do at every funeral, right? Psalm 23. There are Psalms that are joyous. The wisdom literature is this beautiful romantic relationship with God. There's parts of Isaiah that are deeply comforting, my people, right? So as opposed to thinking about it in the categories of Old Testament and New Testament, think about the community for which it's written. Now, it's interesting you bring it up though, because I am right now writing, all morning I was writing the class on the book of Matthew, which is what we're going to do next. And I'm working on the part on the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. And in what you're seeing, you know, with Jesus is somebody who's taking all of this history, all of these scriptures, they're the foundational scriptures for Jesus, right? The prophets, Exodus, Genesis, all of these stories, and then expanding them in a new way, opening up into a new way. And that's what the Sermon on the Mount teaching is. It's ancient Judaism, wisdom and ritual and practice, understood in a new contemporary way for his audience.
I guess a lot of it is, I like to think that we're evolving towards a more positive world, more positive worldview.
Yeah.
And then something happens like, you know, Israel and Palestine's now. And it just makes you think, oh, here we are back in Exodus, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, one of the
That's
articles
kind of discouraging. It's really discouraging.
it is
And
one of
it's
the
not
articles.
just Old Testament, New Testament, but it's more that evolution of our whole thought of our
Right.
relationship to God, not as a personal God that's going to do stuff for us, but more as a resource for us to grow. You know?
Right. Right. We're gonna so the other article I'm sending to you is the reverse exodus that is right now currently hitting on a global crisis, which is you have 2 million people in the Gaza Strip that have nowhere to go and they want to go to Egypt, and Egypt is telling them no. So you have all of these people in Israel right now attempting to flee an occupied, oppressing land, which is what they believe, and go to freedom in Egypt.
Yeah.
And Egypt is saying, no, we can't take them. We can't take them.
Israel doesn't want, I mean, Egypt
I'm
doesn't
sorry,
want
Egypt doesn't.
Hamas. They don't want Hamas.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, also Egypt doesn't want them.
Egypt doesn't want them.
I said Egypt doesn't want
Yeah,
them.
Egypt has said no.
No,
And-
no, actually, none of the Arab countries want them.
Well, in defense, I mean, Jordan is the one that took them the first 75 years ago when there was the massive exodus of Palestinians 75 years ago. They're in Jordan. They're still living there, and it's a huge population. But Jordan
there
has,
is a history when they have taken people in from the Palestinian area, excuse me, of the rebellious groups like the Hamas trying to take down the government. So there are practical reasons for those governments saying we don't want to run this risk, and they're all run by autocrats or kings.
I'm not arguing. I don't disagree that it would be a very dangerous thing and that the component of Hamas is there. I'm just naming that exodus is happening in our world right now. Reverse.
Right.
Yeah, that's all. Go ahead, Paul.
So you were saying we should consider this, if I understood right. The Old Testament was written when the Jewish people were enslaved under Egypt. I mean, and also they were in Babylon. I mean,
yeah. So a lot of the stories. So remember, in ancient times, the primary way story was shared was oral tradition, right? So that's how things were being shared. And then for the Israelites, Babylon comes in, right, in like 600 BCE, destroys the temple and takes away the scribes, takes away the ruling class, takes away the wealthy, takes them all to Babylon. At that point in time is when they start to write down these stories.
okay, the Old Testament. Right, okay. So now the New Testament is written when Rome is occupying Egypt and has the Jews under them.
Yes.
But it's an occupation, not an enslavement. So that's the difference.
So when the New Testament is written, Rome, so when Jesus is born, Rome has been occupying Israel for about 60 years.
Right. Okay.
And so Jesus is born into a war zone, an occupied territory. So I don't know if you could call it enslavement, because they were under the Roman emperor. They had no Roman citizenships, so
They were occupied.
yeah, I would call it there was an occupied territory, is what they were born. Is that what Jesus was born into, and what the New Testament authors write in?
Right. And so that means that the ideas in the New Testament about everyone is included and love thy enemy and turn the other cheek, that's going to work in that situation. And they don't want to
I kid you
warrior
not.
God?
I kid you not. That is the Bible study I wrote today.
Okay. I'll look forward to that.
That's the book of Matthew. We're going to deal with that one.
Okay.
Oh, you're jumping ahead.
You jumping ahead. Yeah. Oh, let me answer. We're over time. So let me answer Bernie's question. Hur is Miriam's son. So Hur is the nephew of Aaron and Moses.
Moses, okay.
Okay.
Thank
Nephew.
you.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone,
Is-
next week we get.
Is his first name Ben?
It's not.
His son.
Next week we take on the 10 Commandments. So I'll see you back here in a week, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Bye.